Welcome to this voyage through one of the most unsettling tales ever told amid the shadowy valleys of the Appalachian Mountains. This story will enthrall you in ways you would not have anticipated, so leave a comment on where you're viewing from now on. This film was made entirely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any similarity to real people living or deceased is entirely coincidental. In a remote area of West Virginia, the trees grow crookedly, and the quiet looms like airborne lead. Only a short path wound between moss-covered rocks to reach the dark wooden cottage, which perched alone atop a hill covered in ancient oaks. Residents of neighboring towns shunned the land for decades, muttering tales of odd lights dancing past windows on moonless evenings and noises that couldn't be attributed to any local animals. A lone guy, whose name was eventually removed from local records, had built the building in 1897. The weathered and weather-darkened cedar planks appeared to absorb the light, making the cabin disappear into the forest's shadows even in the middle of the day. Few people went into those areas, and those who did described a spooky sensation of being watched by unseen eyes concealed amid the old trees. But the cabin's darkest secrets were eventually exposed in the bitterly cold winter of 1963. That year, Christmas fell on a Wednesday, and the mountains were already blanketed in a thick, silent layer of snow. The highways that crossed the Appalachian Mountains were nearly impossible, and the tiny towns strewn throughout the valleys were ready to spend the holidays alone, depending solely on their supplies and the fuel they had gathered to fend off the bitter cold. Many households continued to observe conventions that had been handed down through the years, and the area still preserved its ancient traditions at that time. The only sources of light throughout the long, dark evenings were oil lamps and the dim glow from fireplaces. Most families did not have televisions, and the radio only picked up. Stagnant in the most isolated mountain regions. Because of the seclusion, every home was a world apart, with activities taking place without anybody outside the gates noticing. Everyone thought the spooky cabin had been abandoned for years. When anyone attempted to trace the land's history, county records revealed odd gaps, and no known owner claimed the land. However, some hikers who were traversing the surrounding trail in the weeks before Christmas 1963 vowed to have seen smoke rising from the stone chimney. Others mentioned Early in the morning, the sound of heavy footsteps on the wooden floor reverberated through the trees that were asleep. That December, there was something indescribable in the air in those mountains. Even the forest creatures acted oddly, and the chilly air was heavier, almost tangible. Owls occasionally hooted. Crows collected in unusual numbers in the tallest branches of the pine trees, encircling the enigmatic property, while deer avoided specific areas of the woods. On the eve before Christmas, the valleys were covered in dense fog, which created an impenetrable white veil that surrounded the lodge. With the exception of the sporadic crackling of branches beneath the weight of the accumulating snow, there was complete silence. And something occurred in that deserted building that night as families from far-off towns sat around their little tables. Something that would permanently alter not just the floor's old planks, but also everyone's collective memory. One day, learn what happened at that frigid dawn. The hours after dark brought with them a series of occurrences that could not be explained rationally. For decades, the events that took place behind those four dark wooden walls would remain a mystery, giving rise to myths and terrifying stories in the towns dispersed throughout the mountains. However, the pieces of evidence that eventually surfaced would present a picture that was too dark to completely understand and too unsettling to ignore. The start of Christmas morning was eerie. The mountains were silent. Overnight, the snow had ceased falling, revealing a scene of pure white that mirrored the faint light of the rising sun. However, there was a problem with that silence. as though nature itself realized that something had upset the equilibrium of that neglected area of the Appalachians. The birds that usually filled the air with their morning melodies stayed silent. The marks were initially observed by a hunter. He was on a well-traveled path when he noticed odd footprints in the recently fallen snow that led to the deserted cabin. They weren't the conventional pattern of human boots or the footprints of common forest animals. It looked like something heavy had been carried down the steep slope because of the deep, jagged markings. With a shiver down his spine, the man decided not to look any farther and hurried back to the closest village. Stories started to spread among the locals in the days after Christmas. A woman who lived a few kilometers distant on a farm described hearing distant voices borne by the cold wind when they woke up early on the vacation. Something in the tone of those sounds filled her with fear, even if she was unable to make out the words. Another homeowner claimed to have seen a figure moving wildly and weirdly in the cabin windows, highlighted by a flickering orange light. At the top of the hill, the cabin remained silent and commanding, but it now seemed to exude a more sinister aura. The surrounding trees appeared to lean away from the building, as though even the centuries-old oaks wanted to get away from it. Nobody wanted to look closely at the black blotches in the snow surrounding the property, which could have been mud, filth, or something else. None of the locals dared to approach for weeks. Only old tracks, now somewhat worn by the wind and the snow that still fell intermittently, showed the trail that led there. However, human curiosity is a strong force, and in the end, a group of men from the town. The people decided they had to learn the truth about what had actually transpired on Christmas night. They eventually ascended the slope in early February 1964. The mountains were still covered in winter, and the route was dangerous due to ice that was concealed by layers of compacted snow. Anxiety increased as they got closer to the cabin. It felt colder, and there was an odd smell in the air, a mix of stale smoke, mold, and a Swedish note that none of them recognized. There was a jar at the front door. The wind whistled through the valleys, causing it to sway slightly. A haunting song reverberated across the quiet forest as the rusty hinges groaned in an erratic cadence. Before the most courageous member of the group fully opened the door and revealed the cabin's dim interior, the men exchanged anxious looks. What they discovered within defies easy description. There were markings on the wooden floor indicating that heavy furniture had been hauled in, and the fireplace still held fresh-looking ashes. But there was no furniture in the room. Deep scratches were visible on the walls, as though something had attempted to gnaw through the sturdy wood. Melted candles created uneven puddles of wax on unusual locations, and pieces of ripped cloth were strewn in the corners. The sign, however, was the most unsettling element. None of them recognized the elaborate design that had been painstakingly etched in the middle of the oak floor. When viewed for an extended period of time, interlaced lines created geometric patterns that appeared to pulse, giving the impression of movement that made it challenging to maintain eye contact. Words in an unidentified tongue had been meticulously etched into the wood around the symbol. Every letter was crafted with such accuracy that it appeared to be the creation of an expert artisan. The males were not inside the cabin for very long. They were persuaded to leave that location by the harsh environment and the puzzling discoveries. Each of them had the unnerving sensation that something was still watching from inside that dark place as they sped up the trail. Edifice, something that had not yet completed its job in the forgotten West Virginia highlands, but was not in a rush to divulge its secrets. Communities dotted across the Appalachian valleys experienced increasing uneasiness in the weeks that followed. With every recounting, the tale of the cabin gained more nuance and complexity as it spread like wildfire through a parched forest. Conversations invariably veered toward that accursed location on chilly February evenings when families gathered around blazing fireplaces. An elder from the area, a man with white hair and piercing eyes who had spent his entire life in those mountains, provided an alternative viewpoint high on the hill and the mysteries it held. He mentioned old tales and folklore that existed before the cabin was built in 1897. He claimed that long before the European colonists came, the local population had always regarded that specific hill as a seat of authority. Oral tradition states that it was a location where the veil between worlds thinned, allowing things that shouldn't be there to enter our world. The old guy talked with such passion that it was impossible to simply reject his story, even though no one was certain whether or not to believe him. He talked about other bizarre incidents that had happened there throughout the years. Previously unrelated small instances now appeared to create a troubling pattern when seen together. In the meantime, the cabin stayed above the hill that was never really abandoned but appeared to be lifeless. Travelers who occasionally passed through the region during the day described feeling as though the air itself became heavier and more difficult to breathe as they got closer to the property. As the wind blew through the old boards of the building, several people claimed to have heard whisper-zords that nearly formed coherent phrases before fading into little more than noise. A stranger showed up in the mountains in March 1964 when the snow finally started to melt and timidly announced its arrival. Community closest to the cabin. He was a slender middle-aged man with a bulky bag and dark clothing. He asked precise questions regarding the haunted property and had a certain intensity in his eyes, showing that he knew facts that few locals did. The visitor only described himself as a scholar of mysteries who traveled the nation gathering tales and looking into locations of peculiar activity because he was interested in inexplicable events. He spoke with the people for days, meticulously recording each account in a notebook that is leather-bound and worn. His presence gave the Christmas events a fresh perspective, turning tense whispers into more candid conversations about what might have actually transpired that chilly evening. The visitor declared that he intended to spend the night inside the cabin after obtaining sufficient information. He was adamant about his choice, despite the villagers' attempts to talk him out of it by cautioning him about the risks the area presented. He stated that he had to find out something, and the only way to address the enigma head-on on its own land in order to obtain real answers. Carrying lamps, candles, and his notepad, the guy ascended the well-known trail on the afternoon designated for his vigil. He was joined by a number of people to the foot of the hill, but none of them ventured any farther. His silhouette shrank until it was only a dark blur against the green of the foliage that was starting to re-emerge from winter as they watched him vanish amid the twisted branches. Night descended with its customary veil of dense gloom. The dim glow of lights flickered through the cabin windows, visible to the folks below. Everything appeared normal for hours, or as normal as that strange circumstance could be. However, the light changed at midnight. It became brighter, taking on a greenish tint that had nothing to do with a natural fire. It pounded erratically, resembling the heartbeat of a giant atop the hill. Then the light fully went out, just as suddenly as it had changed. The ensuing darkness appeared more absolute than it ought to have been, as though something too ravenous to be satisfied had ingested even the stars. In the lack of any natural sound, the eardrums were pressed upon by the quiet that fell over the mountains, causing the ears to ring. Unable to sleep, the people waited for daybreak with trepidation, wondering what might be going on up there. A party swiftly assembled to ascend to the cabin as soon as the first rays of sunlight reached the mountain summits. They had to ascertain whether the stranger had made it through the night, and what answers, if any, he may have discovered inside the shadowy walls of that damned building. None of the group could recall how long the climb to the cottage that March morning seemed. Every stride on the muddy path reverberated with a collective hesitancy, and the air retained that heavy, suffocating aspect that had come to define the region. The birds had come back with the spring, but they sounded distant and muffled, as though they were singing from, considerably farther distant than they were in reality. The cabin door was ajar and swaying slightly in the morning breeze when they eventually arrived at the top of the hill. It was vacant inside. The guy was nowhere to be seen, nor were his lanterns, rucksack, or priceless notepad. He seemed to have just vanished into thin air during those gloomy hours. However, he had left behind something that would cause the men to automatically back off. Beside the already complex symbol on the wooden floor, fresh paintings had been added. These were produced with what looked like charcoal from the ashes of the fireplace, but they were different and less accurate. They resembled a map or diagram, with words scrawled hurriedly around the edges and lines joining particular spots. The handwriting appeared erratic and agitated, as though it was done quickly or with quivering hands. One of the men attempted to interpret the words because he was more literate than the rest. The majority were written in a language he didn't understand, were illegible, or were blurred. However, a few English sentences might be seen among the confusion of symbols. They described gateways, cycles that recurred with every generation, and something that patiently awaited beyond the realm of ordinary perception, something that required only a certain night and the correct circumstances to completely transition. The most unsettling finding came from a shadowy area of the cabin. The stranger's leather notebook was partially concealed under a wooden beam. The men carefully picked it up, as though it might be tainted with something terrible yet invisible. The pages were packed, included intricate hypotheses about events that defied common comprehension, precise sketches of the sign on the floor, and thorough notes about the cabin's history. However, the last several pages were what made the reader's blood freeze. The letters grew larger and more erratic. The phrases became less coherent, and the writing gradually degenerated into disjointed bits that alluded to a developing terror or an understanding that no mind should be able to comprehend. At 11:47, the last entry was made, minutes prior to the odd light being visible from below the night before. The soldiers took the journal with them when they descended, and it simply said, "They were right. The veil is real. It is opening." However, neither relief nor sufficient solutions were provided by their finding. If anything, it added to the mystery and heightened the terror that now engulfed the whole mountainous area. No inquiry turned up any information regarding the stranger's whereabouts, and he was never seen again. It seemed as though he had. The last time the greenish light pulsed, it just stopped existing. The Appalachian trees had new leaves and wild flowers as spring had come. However, the cabin at the top of the hill continued to be a black spot in the surroundings. That structure appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, even in the brilliant April sun. The shadows surrounding it were consistently darker, deeper, and moved in ways that were inconsistent with the sun's location in the sky. Stories concerning odd noises kept coming up. A farmer who was strolling through the neighborhood at dusk, claimed to have heard what sounded like chanting emanating from the cabin. A melody that was both exquisite and profoundly unsettling was produced by several voices harmonizing in different tones. On one windless night, according to another resident, smoke billowed from the chimney, rising in a perfectly straight line until it vanished into the darkness above, defying all reasonable expectations about how smoke should behave. The village elder kept the stranger's notepad and analyzed it, cautiously throughout the ensuing months. In isolated locations where civilization had not yet taken hold, he discovered references to such incidents that had allegedly taken place in other regions of the nation. The hut appeared to be a part of a wider network of places connected by forces that conventional science lacked the means to quantify or comprehend. When summer arrived in the Highlands in June 1964 with its oppressive heat, the elder made the decision to conceal and keep the notebook so it may be studied by future generations if they so desired, but they should avoid curious eyes that might be tempted to imitate the stranger's experiments. In order to prevent the knowledge from being lost entirely, but also from being readily available, he hid it in a secret location and only told a trusted individual where it was. The cottage stayed there, silently bearing witness to mysteries that may never be fully discovered. As the hot summer days passed, the locals started to see a pattern in the odd occurrences. They appeared to intensify at specific times of the year, especially around dates that were significant in ancient calendars, dates that signified seasonal transitions, or times when day and night were completely balanced. In that forsaken part of the Appalachian, summer dragged on slowly, bringing with it a delusion of normalcy. Dense greenery bloomed around the cabin, forming a green barrier that made the building even harder to see from the trail below. Nature seemed to be attempting to conceal that location from the sight of man, creating a living curtain of entwined vines and branches that grew with extraordinary strength. Some of the younger villagers started to doubt the tales they had heard during those warmer months. Being born and raised in those mountains, they found it hard to believe that something genuinely unexplainable could exist so near their homes. They contended that the bizarre incidents were only coincidences magnified by collective anxiety and imagination, and that the cabin was just an old building. Among a young man in his 20s, who was more courageous than prudent, made the decision to convince these skeptics that there was nothing supernatural about that hill. He declared that he would ascend to the cabin on a bright August afternoon and spend a few hours there, recording everything with the camera he had purchased in town. The elderman's caution simply made the young man more determined, despite their attempts to talk him out of it. With his camera in hand and an air of confidence that verged on superiority. When he arrived at the cottage, the sun was still high, and golden beams of summer light, almost magical in their splendor, flowed through the trees. He nearly persuaded himself that it was just the foolish superstition of common folk for a brief while as he studied the darkish wooden construction. The heat that had built up within the cabin was oppressive. The light that came through the gaps between the boards caused dust to dance, and the scent of aged wood combined with an unidentifiable substance filled the still air. The charcoal drawings left by the stranger were still there, as was the symbol on the floor, precise and unambiguous. The young man meticulously documented every scene in multiple shots. Then, however, something altered. Despite the intense heat outside, the cabin's inside temperature started to drop. The light from the windows seemed to fade, as though the sun had been abruptly obscured by clouds, and the youngster felt a chill go down his spine. He saw that the sky was still when he peered outdoors, quite obvious. However, the darkness inside the cabin expanded unbelievably, building up like a tangible material in the corners. He tried to take additional pictures, but the camera wasn't functioning properly, and his fingers started to shake. The mechanism became stuck. A faint hum started to come from the device, and the viewfinder only displayed gray static. The sound intensified and got louder, coming from the camera as well as all sides at once, echoing through the wooden walls and causing the floor to tremble beneath him. Feet. The young man came to the startling realization that the elders were correct. There was a presence there that defied both rational explanation and cinematic capture. He had initially written off the sensation of Clear's throat, being watched as paranoia brought on by the stories, but it became indisputable. He was being examined from several angles by invisible eyes that were measuring, evaluating, and making decisions. He made the decision without waiting to see what might happen. The boy sprinted for the door in a fit of utter fear, dangerously fast down the trail, stumbling over rocks and roots but never halting. He didn't pause to pick up the camera that had fallen somewhere along the route. Distancing himself from the suffocating presence he had experienced within the cabin was all that mattered. Despite the unexplained chill he still felt in his bones, he was pale and breathless when he eventually arrived at the settlement, with perspiration streaming down his face. For a few days he kept his experiences to himself, but many who knew him saw the shift in him. A tense caution and a grudging respect for his elders' cautions had taken the place of the arrogance. When he eventually succeeded in expressing his experience, weeks later, his words were cautious and measured. He made no attempt to articulate his feelings. He provided no explanations or theories. He merely affirmed that there was something in the cabin that wasn't part of the world as he knew it, and that it was best to leave it alone. The camera never got better. According to some, it was still up there, buried in the thick undergrowth that around the path. Others thought the cabin had taken it for itself, another human artifact absorbed by that location that seemed to gather fragments of reality and turn them into something else, something that existed on the edge of the possible and the known. The mountains started to turn crimson and gold as autumn arrived, and as the seasons changed, so did the residents' consciousness. The cabin wasn't merely an ancient building with a troubled past. It served as a gateway and a hub for forces that followed laws that people had either forgotten or never fully comprehended. Furthermore, Christmas 1963 was not an isolated incident. Rather, it was a part of a bigger cycle that went on regardless of the worries and inquisitiveness of individuals who were affected by it. The Appalachian Mountains prepared for another hard winter as 1964 came to an end. The leaves on the trees fell off in bursts of color, finally becoming brown. The pathways carpets. The distinctive fragrance of wood burning in the fireplaces strewn over the valleys and frozen land filled the air as it became sharper. And the cottage waited quietly high on the hill, veiled in deepening shadows as the days became shorter. Months were spent examining the patterns found in the notes by the village elder who had kept the stranger's notebook. He contrasted the dates with regional happenings and folk tales that had been passed down through generations, as well as using astronomical observations that previous generations had documented. He was genuinely troubled by what he found, but he also felt oddly resigned, as though he had finally grasped something that had always eluded him. He started discussing his research with a small group of close pals on long November evenings. He described how some locations on Earth had unusual qualities, areas where geography and invisible forces came together to produce special circumstances. The cottage, he clarified, wasn't just a haphazard building in a handy place. Its original constructor knew exactly what he was doing. It had been purposefully placed there. The inscriptions on the walls, the symbols on the floor, and even how the windows are oriented with respect to the cardinal points. Everything had been carefully and precisely arranged. The cabin seemed less like a place to live and more like a tool meant to work with the unique energies of that location. And Christmas 1963 had not been selected at random. Certain things were made feasible by a temporal window formed by that particular date, the positions of the stars, and the meteorological circumstances. The elder disclosed that, based on his investigation, comparable incidents had previously happened, albeit decades apart, always around the winter solstice, usually involving the cabin or the immediate vicinity, and always leaving more questions than answers. It seems as though something occasionally used that location, briefly appearing in our world before resuming its retreat to its own location. However, the 1963 occurrence was unique in some way. The patterns revealed an amplification, as if the phenomenon's underlying force was growing more potent or even more determined to stay in our world for an extended period of time. It wasn't just another wonder why the guy vanished. It was an indication that the boundaries between realities were opening up and that the rules were shifting. As December drew near, the community started to feel more and more tense. Less than a month remained until Christmas, and everyone was wondering if something similar would occur. Some contended that they ought to take preemptive measures, including demolishing the cabin, setting it on fire, and dispersing the ashes. Others thought that the cabin acted as a sort of containment, and that destroying it could release whatever was trapped inside, and that interfering could make matters worse. For weeks, the argument continued, splitting the hamlet between those who favored caution and those who demanded action. Strange occurrences started to appear more frequently in the meantime. At night, strange lights danced around the hillside, not just within the cottage, but also hovering among the trees like enormous fireflies of unbelievable hues. The neighboring valleys produced distorted voice echoes, music, and occasionally what sounded like crying or laughter. It was hard to tell. A woman who resided in the vicinity started getting strong cabin-related dreams. She was overwhelmed with fear when she saw vague figures moving within the building and carrying out rites that she couldn't comprehend. Her nightmares were so vivid that she would wake up shaking and shivering, convinced that she had been there, that she had been transferred while she slept to see things that were not meant for human eyes to view. Similar events started to be reported by other locals. The cabin seemed to be extending beyond its physical boundaries, spreading unseen tentacles through the imaginations and dreams of people who were too close. For some people, the lines separating awareness and sleep started to blur, leading to periods of uncertainty about whether they were seeing reality or a warped version of it. The elder made a choice after recognizing that things were getting worse. He assembled a small group of volunteers who were prepared to take up the risks in order to ensure the community's safety. Collectively, for Christmas Eve, they organized a vigil at the foot of the hill with the intention of monitoring any activity and, if required, taking action in an unspecified manner. There was a growing concern that talking too publicly about their intentions may alert whatever occupied the cabin, so the preparations were done in secret, in part because not everyone in the hamlet would be in favor of such a scheme. To put it rationally, the idea was absurd. The notion that a paranormal entity may hear discussions and foresee human intentions. However, logic was now a luxury that only a select few could afford. The weather in the Highlands altered drastically as Christmas 1964 drew near. The area was hit by an exceptionally powerful winter storm that dumped snow in amounts not seen in years. Villages found themselves cut off from one another when roads became impractical. Every community changed into an island encircled by a sea of white ice. Winter seemed to be working in concert to make sure that whatever would take place in the cabin without outside intervention. Without pause, the snow kept falling and accumulated in piles that reached the lowest dwellings' windows. The wind roared through the valley so fiercely that the oldest buildings shook at the base. And in the midst of it all, the cabin at the top of the hill remained unwavering, visible only as a dark outline against the landscape's universal white, a black ink stain in a world that the storm had completely altered. The snow on Christmas Eve eventually came to an end. As if some invisible barrier that normally obscured part of the celestial view had been temporarily removed, the sky opened up, revealing stars so bright and numerous that they seemed impossible. The night was like something from a dark fairy tale, because the moon was full and low on the horizon, tinging the snow with a silvery luminescence. As scheduled, the elder and his group assembled, dressed in bulky clothing to fend off the bitter cold. Despite the moonlight, they carried lanterns. Was hardly enough to light the way. The walk to the hill's base was quiet, with everyone absorbed in their own thoughts about what might happen that night, which was already starting to feel energized. They sat down to wait when they had finally reached their vantage point, where they could see the trail that led to the cabin. only visible breathing in the freezing air and the occasional positional change to prevent the bone-chilling marked the slow passage of the hours. Chilly. However, just before midnight, something started to occur. That familiar greenish light started to shine through the cabin windows, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to be synchronized with some invisible heart beating deep within the earth, as the already extremely low temperature dropped even further. The observers had never seen any natural illumination like the greenish light coming from the cabin. It poured slowly down the windows as though it had substance, almost like a liquid. Rivulets that are gravity-daying before vanishing into the cold air. The group at the foot of the hill stood still, fascinated by the unbelievable scene that was taking place in front of them, each of them internally torn between the need to comprehend and the impulse to run. The silence was broken first by the elder, whose bravery came more from resignation than from a lack of fear. In a firm yet low voice, he recommended that they approach and ascend at least a portion of the trail to gain a better understanding of the situation. After some hesitation, the group decided to move as a cohesive unit through the deep snow, which made every step a significant effort. Sounds started to reach them as they climbed the hill. These were more intricate and eerie than the melodic chants that some had previously reported. It seemed as though several voices were speaking in various languages at once, overlapping so much that it was impossible to distinguish any one word. However, their overarching purpose and emotional tone were. It's obvious. There was a sense of urgency and something that could be either joy or sorrow. In that strange tune, the distinction between the two is becoming blurry. Under that odd light, the cabin's structure itself appeared different. The shadows that danced on the wooden planks' surfaces did not match the movements of the light that produced them, and the planks themselves appeared to pulse slightly as though they were breathing. It resembled seeing two imperfectly superimposed realities, with their familiar physical world being, progressively replaced by something else, something that functioned with impossible geometries and different laws. As if pulled by an unseen magnetic force, one of the group's youngest members, a man who had insisted on attending in spite of the elder's objections, started to approach the cabin door. He broke free with unexpected force despite the others' attempts to restrain him. He stared at the doorway as though he saw something they couldn't see. When he did speak, his words were fragmented and peculiar. Urgent murmurs about portals opening and invitations being sent, interspersed with words and languages he shouldn't know. The signs were recognized by the elder. The young man's mind was gradually being tuned to frequencies that are typically filtered out of human consciousness for its own protection as it was being called upon. He would probably suffer the same fate as the stranger who vanished months earlier if he went into the cabin in that condition, under the influence of that pulsating light and those mesmerizing noises. The elder made a snap decision and told the others to keep the boy firmly in place despite his protests and his increasingly desperate struggle. However, while they were addressing that pressing issue, another development started. As if matter itself were being rearranged at the molecular level, the snow surrounding the cabin started to melt not because of the heat, but because of something deeper. Before dissolving, the vapor rose in intricate spirals that created geometric patterns in the air, and figures started to appear through the windows. Forms that were not quite human, but had an anatomy that suggested intelligence and purpose came into view. The fluid grace with which these beings, if they could be called that, moved within the hut was both aesthetically pleasing and deeply unnerving. With their hazy shapes blending into intricate dances around the main symbol on the floor, they appeared to be participating in some sort of ceremony. Additionally, the symbol started to glow with its own light as they danced, with each line and curve illuminating in sequence until the greenish light that pervaded the room caused the entire design to pulse in time. The observers were now split between containing the young man and attempting to make sense of what they were seeing. There were those who desired to withdraw, go down the hill, and leave that area to whatever occupied it. Others wanted to stay and see how far it would go, but their fear was overcome by a morbid curiosity. After weighing these conflicting forces, the elder determined that they would stay, but maintain a safe distance, observing without getting involved. His sanity was put to the test in the hours that followed. Inside the cabin, the ceremony grew more intense as the figures moved more quickly and their forms started to take shape, becoming more distinct and real. Then, at what must have been around 3 a.m, everything came to a sudden halt. Like a candle being blown out, the light vanished. The sound abruptly stopped, and the hill fell silent. No one moved for many minutes. The young man who had attempted to enter the cabin had finally relaxed and was now just staring blankly at the dark building, as though he had lost something essential in the struggle. The cabin itself appeared to be unaltered, just another dilapidated structure in a far-off place, with no sign of the impossibilities that had just taken place inside its walls. At last, the elderly man decided it was time to go. Slowly, they made their way down the hill, supporting one another in the snow that appeared even more perilous and profound than the ascent. During the return, nobody said anything. Every individual processed what they had seen on an internal level, attempting to fit those experiences into mental models that were never intended to account for such impossibilities. The sun started to tint the horizon in pink and orange hues as they eventually arrived at the village's relative safety. The world appeared normal once more on Christmas morning, as though the night before had only been a group nightmare. However, they were aware of this. The snow underfoot and the chill that still soaked into their bones were as real as what they had witnessed in the cabin. And because it meant that the universe was much larger, stranger, and less understandable than any of them had thought, this reality was more terrifying than any nightmare could be. After that night, the young man who had been called was never the same. He didn't say much, and when he did, he frequently talked about things that didn't make sense to his audience. He drew the same symbols over and over again on whatever surface he could find, reproducing exactly the patterns he had seen on the cabin floor. On the darkest nights, he would occasionally look longingly toward the hill, as though a piece of himself was still there, imprisoned inside that building that bridged worlds. The community that lived in the shadow of the cabin underwent subtle but noticeable changes in the months that followed that unsettling Christmas of 1964. Wintertime deepened with its typical brutality, dumping snow on top of snow until the Appalachian Mountains appeared to be carved out of icy white marble. However, there was a difference that year, a quality in the air that no one could accurately identify, as though the atmosphere had undergone subtle yet significant changes. After what he had seen, the elderly man pondered in silence for weeks. He was aware that there was no way to just ignore what had occurred. However, he also realized that confronting those forces head-on could bring worse repercussions. The cabin was no longer merely a troublesome building. It was now acknowledged as a nexus, a focal point where the world's natural laws bent and occasionally broke entirely. In a private session with the others who had been there that evening, the elder presented a hypothesis that he had formulated based on his study of the stranger's notebook and other old writings that he had been able to acquire from far-off sources. He thought that the cabin was a reaction to the issue rather than the issue itself, something that was present in that hill's very soil. The person who constructed it in 1897 was trying to channel, possibly even control, or contain the phenomenon rather than creating it. Everything was altered by this viewpoint. Destroying the cabin could release forces that were currently at least partially under control, if it was a tool of containment. However, leaving it in place meant acknowledging that those unsettling occurrences would keep happening, perhaps more intensely with each cycle. It was a decision between two uncertain, unsettling futures. The young man who had been impacted by the call that evening started to show more noticeable changes as the group discussed potential causes of action. His eyes were fixed on something that only he could see, and he stared into nothing for hours. When asked about his observations, he described overlapping layers of reality and how the world that everyone else saw was just the most superficial aspect of something much more intricate. His words had a coherence of their own that suggested he was actually seeing something real, which was why they were unsettling, not because they were unintelligible. He produced increasingly intricate drawings. They were extensions of the cabin's symbols rather than merely copies, as though his mind were decoding a visual language that had hitherto been incomprehensible to humans. He worked feverishly day and night, covering his room's walls with these designs, focus that frightened his friends and family. He reacted with visceral agony when someone attempted to remove them, as though they were destroying something essential or sacred. During that time, the elder paid the young man frequent visits in an effort to learn more about what his mind had taken in from his exposure to the hut's forces. He started to piece together a more comprehensive picture of what was actually happening on that hill through deliberate and patient conversations. The young man claims that the hut acted as a sort of relief valve, enabling subterranean energies to manifest in a controlled way during certain seasons of the year when geological and astronomical conditions were ideal. In the absence of this valve, these energies would look for other outlets and might show up in the area in more hazardous and chaotic ways. The cabin's thoughtfully planned architecture and strategically placed symbols concentrated these manifestations on one area, making them predictable and, in a feel, doable. It was a sophisticated way to deal with the problem that most people were unaware of. However, this arrangement came at a price. Every time the energies appeared, they left their mark on the cabin's physical structure as well as any human consciousness that happened to be in close proximity. Instead of being removed or destroyed, the missing stranger had been changed, his essence woven into the very fabric of that alternate reality that overlaid ours in that particular place. Slowly, the young man who had taken the call was moving in the same direction. His awareness was progressively changing to that different frequency of life. The group felt a renewed sense of urgency after learning this. The young man would eventually reach a point of no return and be permanently split between two states of being if he kept going in that direction. They had to figure out how to return their awareness to their common reality. But how can I do this when none of them really got it? There was no clear answer to the question of the forces involved. The elderly man made the desperate decision to try something. He went back to the hiding spot where he had stored the stranger's notebook, and he spent days going over each page again in search of a clue that he might have overlooked the first time. And he discovered a note that would alter everything in the margins of one of the final entries, partially hidden by an ink stain. It alludes to a different text, a manuscript purportedly housed in a private library in Tennessee has information on how to engage with these points of convergence without getting absorbed by them. The elderly man's new task was to find this manuscript. He wrote letters to people he had made over the course of his long life who shared his fascination with mysterious phenomena and who might know where the documents were. Over the course of the weeks, a path started to take shape. Some of the answers were helpful, while others led to dead ends. In the meantime, springtime arrived in the mountains with their typical new life blossoming. The leaves returned to the trees. The world appeared to resurrect itself in a burst of vital energy as wild flowers dotted the meadows with brilliant colors. However, the cabin continued to be a somber stain in that rebirth, a place where spring appeared hesitant to fully encroach. No birds nested in the branches of the trees nearest the building, and the surrounding vegetation grew twisted and crooked. The affected young man showed slight improvements during this period. The temporal, The bond that had been formed that evening appeared to have been somewhat undermined by the distance from the Christmas event. He still drew compulsively and still reported visions of overlapping realities. But there were moments of clarity where his original personality emerged, allowing for almost normal conversations with those who cared about him. These moments gave hope that perhaps a full recovery was possible if the right intervention could be found. In May 1965, the elder finally received the information he sought. This manuscript existed and was kept in a private collection maintained by a family that had dedicated generations to the study of anomalous phenomena. They were willing to allow him to consult the document, but only in person, as they considered the knowledge contained within it too dangerous to be transcribed or removed from their custody. The elder immediately prepared for the journey, knowing that each passing day increased the risk of losing the young man permanently to that other reality. The journey to Tennessee was long and exhausting, especially for someone of his advanced age, but determination kept him moving through dusty roads and unfamiliar towns until he finally reached the property where the manuscript was kept. It was a large old house surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens that contrasted with the aura of mystery emanating from the place. The manuscript's custodians received him with respectful caution. They led him to a library filled with ancient volumes, some bound in materials he couldn't identify, and introduced him to the text he had come to seek. The manuscript was older than he had imagined, its pages yellowed with age, but still legible, covered in elegant calligraphy and ink that had darkened to a deep brown. What he read in those pages expanded his understanding in a way that fundamentally changed how he perceived the world. The manuscript detailed not only the nature of convergence points like the hill where the cabin was situated, but also methods developed over centuries to interact with them safely. There were protective rituals, symbols that could be used to create barriers, and most importantly, processes to undo connections that had been inadvertently established between human consciousness and those other frequencies of reality. He spent 3 days studying the manuscript, carefully noting only the most essential information, respecting the Guardian's rules against reproducing the text verbatim. When he finally set off to return to the Appalachian Mountains, he carried with him not only knowledge, but also renewed determination. There was a chance, small but real, of saving the young man, and perhaps even establishing a more secure relationship with the forces that inhabited that hill. The return journey seemed shorter, driven by the urgency to put his newfound knowledge into practice. When he finally caught sight of the familiar mountains on the horizon, he felt a mixture of relief at being home and apprehension about the challenges he still faced. The cabin was still there, waiting atop its hill, and the mysteries it held remained as profound as ever. But now he had tools. He had understanding. And most importantly, he had hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way to coexist with that which they could not fully comprehend or control. The elder's return to the mountains of West Virginia marked the beginning of a completely new phase in the community's relationship with the haunted cabin. Armed with knowledge gleaned from the ancient manuscript, he reunited the trusted group that had witnessed the events of the previous Christmas. This time, there was a concrete plan, a methodology tested through centuries by those who came before and faced similar challenges in other corners of the world. The first task was to stabilize the young man whose consciousness had been pulled toward that other reality. The manuscript described a delicate process involving creating a protective circle using specific symbols drawn with natural materials collected from the region itself. It wasn't magic in the traditional sense, the elder explained, but rather a way of using geometric patterns and specific substances to create constructive interference in the frequencies that were affecting the young man's mind. During a new moon night in June 1965, when the darkness was deepest and external influences theoretically minimized, they performed the first anchoring ritual. The young man was placed in the center of a carefully drawn circle on the earthen floor of an abandoned barn, far from the direct influence of the cabin, but still within the same geographical basin. Around him, the elder and other members of the group positioned themselves at specific points, each holding objects that had been prepared according to the manuscript's instructions. Polished river stones, branches from trees growing at specific elevations, and small containers holding water from springs found in particular locations in the mountains. The process took hours. The elder recited phrases in an ancient language he had memorized from the manuscript, his voice maintaining a steady rhythm that seemed to resonate with something fundamental in the fabric of reality around him. The others responded at specific points with their own vocalizations, creating a kind of complex harmony that wasn't exactly music, but possessed a structural quality that could be felt as much as heard. The young man, initially resistant and agitated, gradually began to calm down. His eyes, which had maintained that distant quality and focused on unseen things, slowly regained some of their former clarity. He began to cry silently, tears streaming down his face as something that had been trapped inside him finally found release. When the ritual finally ended with the first lights of dawn painting the sky, he looked at the faces around him and truly recognized them for the first time in months. The recovery wasn't instantaneous or complete. The young man still had episodes where his perception shifted, moments where he saw the overlapping layers of reality he had described before. But now he had control over these perceptions. He could choose to focus on them or let them recede into the background of his consciousness. It was as if he had developed a new sensory modality, a form of expanded perception that most humans didn't possess, but which he was learning to manage instead of being dominated by. With that first victory secured, the elder turned his attention to the hut itself. The manuscript had provided instructions on how to create protective barriers around convergence points, ways to limit when and how manifestations could occur. It wasn't possible to completely seal the point that had been tried before elsewhere and always resulted in disastrous consequences when the accumulated energies eventually breached the barrier with multiplied force. Instead, the approach was to create a more refined control structure, allowing manifestations, but directing them in ways that were less risky for humans who might be nearby. Work began in July, when summer was at its peak, and the days were long enough to allow significant progress before darkness fell. The group could not work directly on the hut during its most active hours, those periods around certain dates and celestial alignments when the forces manifested with greater intensity. But there were windows of time, periods when the hill was relatively quiet, and it was during these windows that they did their work. They began by establishing markers around the property, specific stones placed in calculated positions based on detailed descriptions in the manuscript. Each stone was first prepared through a process involving exposure to sunlight and moonlight in specific sequences, as well as being washed in water collected from different elevations in the mountains. Once positioned, these stones formed an invisible network of subtle influences that did not impede the manifestations, but helped to define them more clearly, creating boundaries within which the forces could operate without bleeding into the surrounding areas. The next step was more complex. It involved creating a second set of symbols inside the hut itself, not to replace the originals that had been placed thereby the unknown builder in 1897, but to complement and refine them. The elder knew that entering the hut was risky, but the manuscript provided specific safeguards that could be employed to minimize the dangers. On an August afternoon, under a perfectly clear sky, the elder and 2 volunteers climbed to the hut carrying the necessary materials. They had prepared for days following purification rituals and focusing their minds through meditative techniques described in the manuscript. Each carried amulets made of specific materials that supposedly helped maintain the integrity of consciousness when exposed to anomalous influences. The interior of the cabin was as they had left it the last time, the original symbols still clearly visible on the wooden floor, the marks on the walls remaining as silent scars of past events. The air inside had that characteristic quality, dense and charged with a palpable energy that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. But armed with their protections and knowledge, they managed to work with. Focused efficiency, following the meticulous instructions the elder had memorized, they added new elements to the existing patterns. These were not corrections or contradictions of the original symbols, but rather extensions of them, like adding new stanzas to an ancient poem to clarify its meaning. They used natural materials, pigments derived from local minerals mixed with specific oils, applying them with careful precision to locations that had been calculated beforehand. The work took several hours, and as they progressed, all three felt changes in the cabin's atmosphere. The oppressive air quality began to diminish, replaced by something more neutral, almost clinical. It was as if the structure was recognizing and accepting the changes, integrating them into its original purpose of channeling and focusing the energies of that place. When they finally finished and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, everyone felt exhausted, but also strangely invigorated. They had accomplished something significant, taken concrete steps to transform a place of fear and mystery into something that could be understood and respected without necessarily being feared. The cabin would still be a place of unusual manifestations, but now there were guardrails, boundaries that would make these manifestations less likely to negatively affect those living nearby. The following months demonstrated the effectiveness of his work. The nature of reports of strange phenomena changed, but they did not entirely stop. Sometimes the light still appeared occasionally in the cabin windows, but they were now confined inside the building rather than extending outside. The noises emanating from the hill became less erratic and more regular. The young man who had been impacted developed into a sort of unofficial sentinel, following patterns that could be reasonably predicted. He formed an odd bond with the hut by using his enhanced sensitivity to keep an eye on its condition and alert people when manifestations were about to happen. That location, one of understanding rather than fear, as though he had made some sort of unspoken deal with the forces that lived there. Without having to make frequent visits, which were getting harder for his aging bones, the elder could keep watch over the place through him. The community started to unwind as the fall of 1965 painted the mountains with its vivid hues. Gradually, the fear that had consumed their minds for nearly 2 years gave way to a cautious acceptance. The mysterious and mysteriously powerful cabin remained, but it was no longer a direct threat. Like the old oaks and the streams that wound through the valleys, it was just a part of the scenery. However, the elder was aware that his work was not yet complete. Christmas would be the next big test, when the circumstances that had led to the most dramatic events would reappear. The changes they had made ought to pass that test, changing what had been a frightening and chaotic manifestation into something more manageable and intelligible. They would establish a precedent that might endure for many generations if they were successful. It was hard to imagine what would happen if they didn't succeed. Preparations for what everyone hoped would be a very different Christmas from the previous one started as the days grew shorter and winter once again pressed its icy hand over the Appalachian Mountains. They wouldn't be terrified onlookers witnessing unfathomable powers this time. They would be aware. In order to guarantee that whatever transpired would take place within safe bounds, participants worked in harmony with the local natural energies. It was a daring goal, possibly even arrogant, but it was the only way to overcome the fear and ignorance that had ruled for so long. In stark contrast to the horror of the year before, Christmas 1965 arrived with a calm. Soft snowfall blanketed the Appalachian Mountains, creating a more serene white blanket over everything, less repressive. Standing there, a dark silhouette against the winter scenery, was the cabin at the top of the hill. However, the way it interacted with the outside world had changed. That night, the elder and his group stood guard out of respectful curiosity rather than fear. They took up their designated positions and watched the stars slowly move across the pitch-black sky. And the manifestation started as they should have at midnight. Vibrating through the cabin windows, the greenish light reappeared. But, instead of spreading into the nearby forest as it had previously, it stayed contained this time. Additionally, the sounds that reached them had changed. Even though the voices were speaking in unidentified languages, there was still an unearthly feel to them, but they now had a tone that was more harmonious than chaotic, almost musical. It appeared as though the forces that occupied that location had acknowledged and embraced the modifications, adjusting to the newly set boundaries. The youth, who had been changed by his encounter the year before, maintained his composure during the manifestation. With his unusual eyes, he saw layers of reality that others were unable to see, but this time he was not drawn to that different frequency of existence. The safeguards were in place, permitting observation without transformation, comprehension, or absorption. Everyone sensed a fundamental shift when the light eventually went out in the wee hours of the morning. The cabin remained a location of. It was no longer an open wound leaking chaotic influences into the world, but rather a place of mystery and power, where the boundaries between realities thinned. It resembled a well-kept door that opened in accordance with natural cycles at certain times, and could be shut again without causing any harm. The neighborhood started to form a new bond with that location in the days that followed. It was a sort of practical peace, not love, of course, and maybe not even total acceptance. They had discovered that while there are some things in the world that cannot be fully explained or controlled, they can still be respected and handled carefully and wisely. Satisfied with their accomplishments, the elder started writing down everything he had discovered. He was aware that the knowledge he had gained needed to be preserved for future generations, because he would eventually be unable to lead the community. He meticulously detailed the protective rites, the symbols, and how to interpret the signs that told when. Manifestations were on the horizon. It was an enduring legacy of comprehension based on personal experience. In the years that followed, the cabin stayed atop its hill, a permanent fixture in the mountainous terrain. The tale of that solemn building became ingrained in the local folklore as generations passed. Others viewed it as a strange natural phenomenon, a geographical oddity where peculiar circumstances produced unexplainable effects, while others saw it as a cursed place to be avoided. However, those who were fully aware of the truth, the silent watch was maintained by the descendants of those who had collaborated with the elder and gained knowledge from his experiences. They kept an eye on the cycles, kept the protective markers in place when needed, and made sure the delicate equilibrium created at Christmas 1965 was maintained. Thus, the cabin remains in a remote mountain valley to this day, a silent observer of mysteries beyond human comprehension. It serves as a reminder that the world is far stranger and larger than we typically acknowledge that there are. Locations where the rules don't always apply, and that sometimes the best way to be wise is to learn to live in harmony with the unknown rather than trying to conquer it. On some nights, the shadows that move in their windows are regarded with cautious reverence rather than fear. They understand that the greenish light that periodically pulses through their old planks is a part of a greater cycle that is outside of human control but within human understanding. Additionally, those who reside in that hill's shadow bring with them the understanding that some mysteries can still frighten people without having to be fully resolved. Consider subscribing to the channel if this story moved you and piqued your interest in the bizarre locations that exist on the periphery of our shared reality. There are a ton of untold tales. There are more sinister mysteries buried in this huge nation's forgotten corners. And who knows, maybe one of these tales will relate to something you have gone through. The moment when reality's thin veil opened. Just enough to give you a taste of what's ahead until the next adventure through the mysteries and shadows that occupy America's most remote and forgotten regions. Yes,